Goedenavond, beste vrienden. In naam van het ganse LVV-bestuur heet ik u van harte welkom op onze digitale gespreksavond met niemand minder dan Johan Norberg. De vaccinatiecampagne in ons land draait op volle toeren, dus we hopen allen van harte dat dit onze laatste digitale bijeenkomst zal zijn. We hopen oprecht dat we vanaf het najaar terug fysieke activiteiten zullen kunnen organiseren in het Brusselse. Ik zal vanaf nu overschakelen naar het Engels, omdat we uiteraard het gesprek met de heer Norberg ook in die taal zullen voeren vanavond. It is with great pride that we present to you tonight's speaker, Mr. Johan Norberg. Mr. Norberg is a best-selling author and lifetime proponent of free markets and open societies. He has been standing on the classical liberal barricades for a little over 2 decades now. Mr. Norberg first burst into the scene in the beginning of this century with the publication of the book In Defense of Global Capitalism, which he convincingly dismantled all of the arguments of the anti-globalization movement. It was one of the first books on classical liberalism that I personally read as a 16-year-old, and it profoundly shaped my thinking on economics and political philosophy. I am therefore very pleased that our political officers have managed to persuade Mr. Norberg today to present his latest book on openness and human progress. So all credits go out to Peter and Lawrence, who will also moderate tonight's talk. News reached me that Peter even went for a haircut, especially for tonight's event. So Peter and Lawrence, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thibaut, and welcome everybody. I'm Lawrence van Nove, and together with my colleague Peter Koene, we will indeed moderate the interview tonight. So I think Thibaut already gave a very good let's say introduction to Mr. Norberg. He forgot that talking about haircuts, Mr. Norberg started off as a left-wing anarchist, but then rapidly evolved into a champion of liberty. Apart from this book, he also wrote Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future, a book from 2016, which was translated in Vooruitgang. And it's a book which is very popular, not only with liberals, but also in a broader spectrum, like the eco-modernist movement in Belgium is very enthusiastic about it. Another thing which is interesting is that he's part of the Free to Choose network, for which he made a modern day version of Milton Friedman's Free to Choose series called Free or Equal. And more recent, he also made a series especially for America, Lessons for America from Sweden. So that's also an interesting take. So today we're here to discuss his latest book, Open, which is translated very well in Hoe een open wereld ons verder brengt en waarom we dat soms vergeten. It's a book which got raving reviews. The Economist is very enthusiastic. Even people like Steven Pinker advised the book. And so we're very honored. And also, just as Thibaut, for me, Mr. Norberg was one of my inspirations as a student. It's a big honor to have this evening. My colleague Peter will now introduce the first topic. He will take us to a trip to Austria in Ötztal. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lawrence. First, to start with, this is the example of the Dutch version of Mr. Norberg's book. First of all, thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Thibaut, who in the meantime left. And of course, thank you, Mr. Norberg. One small anecdote. I met Mr. Norberg already in 2005 during a celebration of the 75th birthday of LVSV Gent, the student movement where Thibaut, Lawrence, and I were board member, not at the same time, but I was a board member in 2005. And I also remember the nice chat after his inspiring speech we had with Mr. Norberg while drinking some Belgian beers, but this as a detail. No, Mr. Norberg, in your book Open, you start with the example of Ötzi, a man, as Lawrence mentioned, who lived somewhere between Austria and Italy. You describe him, you describe his clothes, his weapons, his equipment. I think you can make a comparison with Milton Friedman's pencil growth, but Can you explain us what's the importance of Ötzi for openness, for liberalism?
Well, thank you. That's a great starting point, and actually, I think it's perfect to look at it in association with those ideas about how do products today come to be in an incredible network of thousands of people around the world cooperating voluntarily to bring us a pencil or a cup of coffee or something like that. And fascinatingly, this also was the case for Ötzi even 5,300 years ago. Even at that level of not that much technological sophistication, no large-scale infrastructure, and yet he managed to travel as far as he did because he made use of the ideas and the work of hundreds, if not thousands of people. You can see that in his hat was made of bear skin, and leggings and coat were made from goat. And I don't think he both hunted the bear and tended to goats himself. His shoes were designed for walking on snow. They had bear skin for soles and deer hide for the top panels, so complex that researchers speculate that even more than 5,000 years ago, they had specialized shoemakers in this area, somewhere around there. And you can see that in almost everything. He was carrying 61 tattoos, probably related to pain relief treatments that someone had come up with, daggers, blade blanks that he had not produced himself. And interestingly, the raw material for some of his stuff was mined from different areas, as far as 60 kilometers away. So archaeologists speculate that 5,300 years ago, we had large-scale, long-distance trade works in the Alpine region, which tells us that trade and free markets, that's not a novel invention. It's new that it's allowed to be this free for such a long time, but it's not novel to human beings. It is in our nature.
Thank you. And were there other examples in history of open societies that flourished thanks to openness?
Yes, you can start in many different places, and actually you can find the first examples of long-distance trade works in East Africa some 300,000 years ago. And if you remember your biology and archaeology studies 300,000 years ago, that's as old as Homo sapiens. In other words, it was there from the beginning. But then if you look at history in settled civilizations, we have had golden ages in all different civilizations and based on different faiths and ethnicities and on different continents. Heathen Greek city-states, Rome, the Muslim Abbasid Caliphate 1,000 years ago, China, obviously, especially during the Song dynasty. We've had it in Catholic Italian city-states and other places. And what sets them apart was that they were, compared to other regions at the same time, other civilizations, they were open. Not in our sense, not in a nice liberal humanitarian way. They were often vicious warlords and brutal against outsiders and dissidents from within. But once they conquered places, compared to other civilizations, they began to integrate other groups, respect their beliefs, and give a career promotion a potential for people from other groups, which means that they were more open to trade. And all of that means that they could make use of the brains of more people, of the hard work of more people than the more authoritarian and hierarchical societies that were there at the same time.
And would you say that there's some kind of evolutionary psychology aspect to that? Is that something which you can see as a red line throughout history?
Oh yes, I think it's in us. It's in our nature, and to understand that, you can just sort of look into a mirror. And if you don't have a mirror, look into my eyes, and then you notice the white of my eyes. And that doesn't seem very remarkable. We're all used to it. But it is unique in the animal kingdom. Our ape cousins and other mammals, they have brown eyes so that they hide their gaze from even their closest friends and kin, because they're primarily rivals. If they find a prey, they want to get there first so that nobody else get that idea. But for some reason, at some point in time, probably some 3 million years ago, it began to be a benefit to our ancestors to share your attention, to broadcast your intention to others, so that if you see a prey, you want others to see it so they can help you get it. And so cooperation is something that made us unique. Why did Homo sapiens conquer the planet? We're not that fast. We're not that strong. We can't even fly. Why human beings? Well, it's probably the fact that some of our ancestors 3 million years ago realized that they were unprotected and died on the East African savanna. They were killed by large cat animals, by lions and hyenas and saber-toothed tigers, until some of them realized that if they threw stones at those animals, and if they do it simultaneously and surrounded them, they could defeat those animals and they could climb to the top of the food chain. And this meant that there was an evolutionary advantage to humans who could cooperate, who could look at the intentions of others, give them something, favors, ideas, know-how, goods and services, and get something else in exchange. That has been the red line throughout humanity's existence, and that's why we're here.
Indeed, and basically, the working together and the cooperation has a competitive advantage aspect as well, which we can bring to today's world. How would you look at that? How did that evolve through time?
Yes, then what happened was that we're instinctively skilled at cooperating, at trading, and starting to share and find out the intentions of others, even strangers. But then obviously it has not been accepted everywhere, because trade and exchange is also a threat to the status quo, especially political and religious elites or powerful incumbents in the economy, so they stifle it. But in some areas it managed to get through. In certain areas, especially sort of coastal areas, in cities and in urban areas, and then those places started to prosper. And then it's been a back and forth throughout history. Have we been open to that kind of trade and exchange or not? And well, we're still there. It's back and forth constantly. But we can definitely see that the reason why we've, for the last 200 years, have made such a rapid progress, starting in Western Europe, but then spread throughout the rest of the world, is that we began to protect more of security in property and freedom of association and of trade.
Yeah, it's probably what we would say the great enrichment, which Deirdre McCloskey, for example, writes about. Could you somehow link that as well to other ingredients? I'm thinking of immigration. Is there also an an aspect of culture, of open-mindedness?
Yes, and that's also what we can see historically, that one reason why the Roman Empire triumphed for a long time and the Song dynasty in China prospered was that they were open not just to trade, but to outsiders. And even people from the periphery of the Roman Empire could advance into the Senate and all the way to becoming an emperor. In Song China, when you wanted more astronomy, well, you hired a Muslim astronomer, because they knew more about those things. You hired the best Persians for fighting, because they were better at it than you. So they've always been at the crossroads between civilizations and being open to it, those who did that. And we can see that today as well. In a way, immigration is like trade. It's the ability to make use of the ideas and of the hard work of more people. But in a way, it is more important because, as Hayek and others have taught us, most of our knowledge is not verbalized. We might not even know what kind of knowledge we have, but we can see the results of it when we act. So unfortunately, it's not enough with just long distance trade and Zoom meetings and so on. You also have to meet people so that new ideas can be combined in new ways. Why did Pfizer, BioNTech come up with the first successful mRNA vaccine in history in such a record period of time? Well, it was that combination of descendants of Turkish migrants to Germany who had their own unique perspective on the world, met the knowledge that was existed in Germany, combine it with American big pharma, and then something new, amazing happened.
If we look at immigration, and I'm now playing a bit devil's advocate, our opponents would say that it cannot be combined with Western European welfare states, and that there are also some cultural issues might be. What would be a reaction? What would be our reaction, or your reaction, if I may say, to this argument?
Yes, and I think we have to take those arguments seriously, and not the least because it dominates our politics today. When we look at the history of migration, what happens is that people do not travel across the world because they want to sort of sit on the couch, because they are more adventurous, more entrepreneurial, and often more open-minded to other ideas. Think about it yourself. If your local neighborhood was destroyed by war or famine, who would be the first to take the boat to another country on the other side of the planet? It's probably not those who are most traditionalist, those who are the most stuck in their ways, those who are sort of the most lazy in certain ways. And that's what we've seen. They are hard workers who want to make a living and thereby also enrich the societies they come to. But there is a point when it comes to the problems of the welfare state. The welfare state in the Western European way has often been built for a very homogeneous population with the same sets of skills and language and experiences. So everything from our minimum wages to our collective bargaining to our tax and welfare system is based on that. And I think this has combined with the fact that we've admitted so many refugees from very poor places with little education means that they've been shut out from specifically the labor market, where integration happens historically. And that creates social exclusion. It creates these neighborhoods where you rarely meet many sort of natives. And in that case, you short circuit some of that. To me, that's an argument to reform our welfare states and change the incentives, make it easier to work and make it more difficult to live on welfare rather than to shut our borders.
Yes, and then again, I will play devil's advocate, but some political parties strongly defend the welfare state and also the things which are linked with the welfare state, as you mentioned. And how can we reconcile democracy and immigration?
Well, the fact that people don't agree with me is unfortunately nothing I can take responsibility for. Perhaps I haven't been convincing enough since those parties keep insisting on that. But what I do think is that many people have seen this choice between generous welfare states and open borders, or at least fairly liberal attitudes to migration. And they've made the decision to keep the welfare state and shut our borders. What I think is that if you see that dilemma, that problem, I think it shouldn't be too difficult to have a line of argumentation that says that, look, for our sake as a society, we have to constantly rejuvenate and regenerate with new ideas and new people and new workers and so on. And for their sake, people who are leaving terrible circumstances, who are only looking for an opportunity to do something. Can we find some sort of compromise here? Can we perhaps build more of a wall around the welfare state rather than around our countries, so that you will have to pay into the system before you get things out of the system. Perhaps we'll see. So far, those groups have not been convinced, but we'll keep on working at it.
I think personally, I agree very much with your last point, but it remains a difficult balance between basically convincing people of closing the welfare state for a part and not being anti-migrants. I have the impression that very rapidly in discussions, if you talk to progressives who would be a partner in more openness to migration, they quickly shut down to that. So maybe my last question about this aspect is, how could we also make a convincing, compelling argument towards more left-wing oriented people that we basically have a similar interest for those migrants in mind?
Yeah, I've noticed that problem as well. And of course, there is a problem for people more on the left because of their focus on equality. Obviously, opening up to people who are more poor, have lower education, it means that they will have to start on a lower rung of the ladder when they enter the labor market and so on. And especially if we have different systems, if we can't reform the welfare state entirely, if we just do it for the migrant. What I would say is that I would remind them of not remind them because they've probably never seen it. There's a Swedish cartoon about this whole dilemma where a leftist politician talks to a refugee and says that the refugee says, look, my kids are starving. I just want to do a fair day's work and be able to live here in security. And she says that, no, it's not that easy, because here we want to give you all these things, and then mentioning lots of the welfare policies and all the goods and entitlements that he would be entitled to. And then he says, oh, okay, that's fine. If you want to give me that, that's fine. Oh, no, we can't afford that, says the politician. So we're going to have to shut the borders to you. Sorry, bye-bye. And that's the dilemma that people on the left have to think about. Right now, that those kinds of welfare policies are shutting down Europe to migrants. And I don't think, if they really think about what could improve the world and life for people in desperate circumstances, I think they would have to agree that we need some reforms.
Thanks very much for that. I think we basically concluded a bit the first part of your book, which is called Openness, where you make the argument pro. But you already are making the bridge towards our opponents who have a more closed vision. And you start off with a quote of Mario Vargas Llosa in that part. And maybe interesting, some of our viewers are members of Willemsfonds, which is a literary organization. It's maybe a nice fait divers to tell them that Vargas Llosa is actually also part of the liberty movement of the liberal world. Have you ever met him?
I have met him a couple of times, actually, and I've lectured when he was sitting on the front row, and I told him straight away, look, I'm going to have to tell you, I'm very intimidated by this, because he's one of my favorite novelists, and he's also an important classical liberal thinker. So I told him I haven't been this intimidated since I did work out in a gym in Reykjavik in Iceland. And when I looked up from my machine in a hotel gym then, when I looked up from the machine, Clint Eastwood was standing there and waiting for his turn. So that's the relationship I have with Mario Vargas Llosa. The reason why I use this quote from him is that it's about the call of the tribe, and the fact that what liberalism really is a struggle against tribalism, which is also part of our nature. We're not just traders, we're also tribalists, and we have this tendency to divide the world in us and them. And collectivist ideologies and authoritarian ideologies, they always build on this call of the tribe. And Mario Vargas Llosa's point is that this will always keep returning. And that's why we constantly have to fight it, because we can never win a decisive win against it, because it's part of our nature, but we can lose. And that's a terrible consequence in that case.
Maybe, you start off in that chapter also about trade myths and zero-sum thinking. How is it related to that tribalism that you just mentioned? Is that something also in human nature, or is it more a cultural thing? How do you see that?
Yes, no, I really think this is part of human nature as well. We have a double nature. And I only told you half the story when I talked about how we managed to cooperate, and we threw stones in synchronization, and we climbed to the top of the food chain. But what happens when you climb to the top of the food chain and no predator can ever threaten you again is that you only have one enemy left. And that is other groups of humans who cooperate even better than you do, because that could be a potential threat against you and yours and to your life. And that has unfortunately been part of our history as well. We've evolved during fairly aggressive circumstances. We did cooperate with strangers as well. We had long distance trade work with strangers as well. But the moment we found strangers who were not loyal to us, did not wish us well, it could end up in us being removed from the gene pool immediately. So a certain suspicion against others and the fact that they might have other intentions and dangerous intentions is part of our nature. And we have to keep in mind when we talk about evolution on hundred thousands of years of scale, we lived in situations where the slightest mistake could lead to death, which means that certain of our fears, and I think that this fear of the other and that they might turn out to be hostile, it has to be oversensitive. It has to, like a smoke detector, a fire alarm, is designed to be oversensitive, because it is much better to have a couple of false alarms and sort of leave the hotel or leave your apartment rather than missing one real fire, because that would be the end of it. And this collectivism that's within us, this suspicion of others, is also designed to be oversensitive to any kind of sign that the other group has. They speak in a strange way, they look strange, or they cheer for another football team or something like that, is enough to sort of trigger this kind of tribalist emotion. And that's why it's unfortunately always there.
Indeed, you speak about the tribal reflex of some people. Indeed, if we make then the link to economy, then something which pops up is the trade deficit. And some more nationalist politicians would mention that. But how relevant is this topic?
Oh, it's completely irrelevant. So I wish we could leave it, but it keeps popping up. And even Adam Smith, even in his time, he said that, look, nothing is as absurd as this idea of that we should have to worry about some sort of trade balance with others. And the reason why it's absurd is that, we have trade deficits and trade surpluses with different people and different regions and different countries. And I mean, I have a terrible trade deficit with my local bookshop because I buy from them all the time. That's not a loss. It's my gain because, I can't. That's why I go there and buy those stuff. But I have trade surplus with my the publisher of my books, for example. And the thing is, you can always then look at a global level. Look, compared to a certain country, you have a trade balance. Well, that's because they probably offered you something that's better, and that doesn't matter because you get your resources to buy that with a trade surplus with somebody else. Or It's the fact that you do it on because you borrow so much or you get so much investments into your country by others. That might also be the case, and then it's related to that, not to trade policies. You can see that it's always about sort of savings rates in a particular country or public debt, things like that, rather than the particular trade policy you have. I don't worry more about trade deficits with other countries than I do with sort of Stockholm's trade deficit with Stockholm's suburbs, or the blocks of flats that we have here compared to the other block of flats. It's just irrelevant.
And what would you say to someone who says that, for example, China would use this trade balance or would buy American bonds, state bonds, for strategic reasons? And how is there always a level playing field? Because, for example, a country like China, they don't believe or they don't follow the international liberal order.
Yeah. China is a particular case. It is worrying with a great, huge economy with totalitarian leaders that threaten their neighborhood. But I would say when it comes to trade and the fact that they buy American public debt, that's actually one of our best hopes for continued peace between these superpowers. It's a mutually assured economic destruction, which means that it's if something goes very bad for the US, it's very bad for China as well. When it comes to the trade balance generally with China, I mean, it's a country that has grown amazingly in the last few decades, and it's done so because it has begun to open up certain areas of the economy, and that's impressive. And it's a good thing that the Chinese people don't starve anymore. But when it comes to and that means that everything will look large. Their trade looks impressive as well, even though as a percentage of GDP, it's fairly small compared to European countries. But we have to keep in mind that a lot of that is, especially when we talk about the trade balance, is not really things that they produce. It's not really value that they add. It's stuff that they sell and it's money that they get in. But they do buy lots of inputs for it as well. The last time I looked at iPhones, it looks impressive because they assemble the iPhones and sell it to me, and it looks like a terrible trade surplus with Sweden or with the United States. But who gets the value? Because they buy the inputs, they buy the design, they buy the software, they only assemble the thing basically. So China and Chinese workers get 1.3% of the value of a sold iPhone. It looks much bigger in the trade balance, but that's because we don't think about all the Taiwanese and Korean and American and certainly, I'm sure, Belgian inputs that goes into the iPhone and all the other products that they sell as well.
Yeah, I think the whole trade balance thinking is one example of a much broader aspect of zero-sum thinking. We had a president since a couple of months, not anymore, luckily, but President Trump was very well known for his zero-sum thinking. How would you see it more broadly? So not only for trade, but in general, what's the state of zero-sum thinking post Donald Trump?
Yeah, zero-sum thinking is it's the result of tribalist thinking, and you can see the moment people think that they're playing a zero-sum game with others, then they become tribalists and they only want to fight for their own and be aggressive towards others, and this is all historically it made sense. Even though we had all that long-distance trade and so on. It's been a very short period of time when we've had economic growth to such an extent that people saw in their own lifetimes that most boats could be lifted by the tide. So we're more adapted to thinking that if someone was very rich and successful, had the best land or something like that, they took it from us, because they probably did some 500 or 50,000 years ago. It's a way to protect ourselves against robbers and raiders and free riders and so on. But it doesn't make sense in a market economy where no deal ever happens unless both parties think that they gain from it. Well, that zero-sum instinct is still there. The tribalist instinct is still there. It doesn't take much for a demagogue like Donald Trump to reinforce it and just tell us, look at the Chinese, they're very rich. Look at the Mexicans, they're benefiting right now. Or the Europeans, or European car manufacturers. It must mean that we lose out, right? And that triggers something within us. We think we're under threat and we have to fight back. And unfortunately, when that happens in a major and an influential country, it triggers something in other places as well, especially if you start a trade war, because then others think that they have to defend themselves against the competition, which really means defend themselves against using the brains and hard work of more people than others. So I think that Donald Trump and everything that he represents has triggered lots of zero-sum thinking in international affairs right now. And one indication of that is that his successor, Joe Biden, he says that America is back, but you know what? America is not back as a free trader. He keeps most of the tariffs in place, and he even reinforces things like Buy American in procurement policies.
Thank you. I think this is a proof that there's still some work to do for liberals. And I think another economic concept is GDP and the allocation of GDP between the different parties in the economy, and also inequality. Some people will say that there is more and more inequality due to liberalism. Is that correct? Is that relevant?
Well, yes and no. I would say it depends on why we're unequal. Because, I mean, take China as an example. And again, China is not a model that I sort of am especially fanciful of. On the contrary, it's in many ways a very dangerous country. But compare China to today to where it was in 1980. It is a much more unequal place. It is terribly unequal. It has increased inequality faster than I think almost any other country on the planet. Does that mean it's a worse place today than in 1980? Well, when you look at poverty statistics, China has gone from 9 out of 10 people in extreme poverty to 1 out of 10, no, less than 1 probably, out of 10 people in extreme poverty today. Which means that what has happened is that China has experienced enormous growth, created lots of wealth, which is wonderful, but wealth doesn't sort of appear in every place in the same way at the same time. There's always inconsistencies, and especially coastal areas with lots of trade will benefit much more than others. And in urban areas with access to more human capital and specialization and so on. So growth can result in inequality. And in that case, I'm not worried about inequality because that's a relationship. It's not an absolute standard. I'm worried about people and their living standards. And if people are better off, that's a good thing. On the other hand, in China, they also have things like the haiku system, which means that it's very difficult to move from rural areas to urban areas and enjoy the opportunities that are there. That creates an inequality that is not a result of more opportunity and wealth, but by restricting opportunity and wealth for people. So that's the division that I think we have to keep in mind when we talk about inequality.
Yeah, one concept I really liked in your book, and maybe you can share it also with the audience, is a so-called Jeff Bezos test that you do. Basically, why the calculating in GDP and just income inequality is maybe obsolete in today's day and age.
Yes, and that's a test that I invented for myself when I thought about this thing about the super rich, because that's really what lots of people are worrying about when they talk about inequality, that as long as a small group of successful entrepreneurs are rewarded in terms of capital rather than normal salaries, they will keep on moving away from the rest of us. And if you look at them compared to where we are, inequality will always grow. And then the question that I asked myself was, yes, Jeff Bezos is probably 10 million times, or probably more, I don't know, 10 million times richer than I am. But that's just dollars and cents. The question is, can I find any other area of human experience, of consumption of goods and services, where he is 10 million times better off than I am? And then I went through it and thought about it, the clothes he wears, the way he lives, the house. He probably affords a large mansion, several large mansions, but that's nothing new compared to what the rich did 100 or 200 years ago. The new thing is that the broad middle classes and even most of the poor can afford to live in homes with safe water and heating and electricity and so on. He can fly on a private jet, but that's and he doesn't have to wait in line at airports, and that's great. But the new and more dramatic thing is that more people, hundreds of millions of people, have been given the opportunity to fly to other places. On that plane, he doesn't eat dramatically different probably from what we would do on a regular and on an economy ticket, because now we can afford exotic goods and food and wine and Belgian beer in the air almost wherever we are. And the computer he uses, the cell phone he uses, it might even be the same that I use, even though he's 10 million times better off. And he certainly doesn't have 10 million times better access to information and knowledge on that cell phone. And neither does his children have 10 million times better access to education, 10 million times larger likelihood of surviving to their 5th birthday or their 50th or even the 70th. So my point with the Jeff Bezos test, and there might be other areas where he actually is 10 million times better off than I am, but I haven't found one yet. And here's the thing. That would have been the case in any other era of history, even though they might have seemed like in dollars and cents, inequality was smaller. Well, inequality in terms of the goods and the services that we consume is more equally distributed between the broad middle classes and the super rich than it has ever been before. And actually, one of the reasons for that is that people like Jeff Bezos have been allowed to benefit tremendously by reducing the cost of all these goods and services, so that we can all afford it today.
Maybe closely related to Jeff Bezos, he's basically an entrepreneur, and okay, there might be some criticism to the way he organizes his company, but in the end, he's a real entrepreneur who became rich of people buying his goods and services. In your book, however, you also make the argument, or you tell that 25% of current billionaires are basically accumulated their wealth due to cronyism. First of all, maybe for our audience, what is cronyism? What is the critique exactly? And then second of all, what can we do about it? How can we change the world that basically people get into a billionaire status due to helping others and not basically playing as there was some game, so to say.
Well, this is an incredibly important point, because this goes back to the question about, is inequality fair, even good, or is it bad, and do we have to fight it? Well, if it's the result of some people coming up with better solutions to our problems than ever before and benefiting from that, that's great. If it happens because they do not compete by coming up with better goods and services, but competing in coming up with better connections to politicians and to dictators, so that they get the ability to rob us, basically, consumers and citizens and taxpayers. That's the question. And that's what cronyism is about. It is about being a crony. It's about not getting your revenue and your profit in voluntary deals with people, but by stifling the competition, by being protected through particular government contracts, being into certain areas where you get subsidies, bailouts, tariffs, and other things from politicians. Well, in that case, it's something that we have to fight. And this index that I looked at on crony capitalism, it measures, it has this measurement that around a quarter of the world's billionaires, it doesn't say that they're cronies, but they are in certain areas of the economy that are very susceptible to monopoly, to government favors, things like mining, commodities, defense production, banking, tech and telecom and infrastructure and so on, real estate. And that tells you immediately that, I mean, you don't have to be a crony to be in those markets. I mean, Jeff Bezos is in tech after all, and I don't consider him a crony. But it tells you that probably lots and lots of the billionaires are, and of the smaller players as well. And what do we do about that? Well, we have to constantly work incredibly hard to create a level, not a level economic playing field, but a level regulatory and political playing field for all these different entrepreneurs. Make sure that there's always at least a potential competition against everybody, and no particular favors given to any company, no matter how important they are. That's the problem. As soon as they get sufficiently large, they're too big to fail, and therefore they become so big that they're too big to fail. But one thing that we have to keep in mind is that often when we talk about that, people say, well-meaning people who notice these problems say that we have to just regulate them harder and what they do. But wait a minute. Who is most able to deal with detailed regulations about what you can and cannot do? Who has benefited over these last 10 years from banking regulations? Well, you know, the big investment banks immediately hired 5,000 people to just make sure that they followed and circumvented all the rules. Whereas new upstarts and new sort of tech startups that could have competed with the big ones, they can't do that. I heard the other day that, I think this was on Swedish radio, they were so impressed by Facebook's boss because he has suddenly said that, look, we have to be regulated. Now I've found out that, yeah, we need to be regulated so that we have moderators who check everything. I think that's a good idea after all. And the journalist or the commentator said, isn't that wonderful? He has suddenly turned around from being this ruthless capitalist to suddenly being this humanitarian who realizes that he needs to be regulated. Well, whenever a capitalist tells you that they want regulations, well, you should be concerned because your pocket is about to be picked and the other competitors are about to be stifled. Because who can afford to hire 10,000 people who look at all the contents and moderate everything all the time? Well, I think Facebook is probably the only one who could do it, which means that it'll cost him to hire 10,000 people, but at least it will give him a lifelong monopoly. So we should be worried about all the kinds of favors that big companies get, even the regulatory ones.
Yeah, in the end, there is some similarity between what happens in that field and politically. Regulation sort of consolidates the status quo, so to say, and having that contestation of power and being able to compete and offer a better alternative is also a part of our open-ended story. You know, the open-endedness of which then, on the other side, the left-wing side, the so-called progressives in the American sense then, or the conservatives try to sell us. Maybe if you could go into that as well.
Yes. I mean, the common denominator basically between these two groups. The thing is that we liberals are alone in appreciating surprises and open-endedness. And when we're being asked about sort of what's your utopia, what do you think the society of the future should look like, or the human beings tomorrow? Well, I want something that surprises me. I don't want to have a detailed plan. I couldn't come up with it, obviously, but I wouldn't want it, because everything great that we have in our world today, everything we cherish, and the left and the right as well, has come from surprises and has been very controversial. Look at the history of technology and of goods and of culture. Everything was hotly contested and controversial originally, from the way we celebrate Christmas to the bicycle, which was terrible according to everybody. It would give people, women would be infertile if they rode bicycles, and people would end up with a bicycle face if they rode on the bike, and sort of keeping the balance, and it would destroy old industries, because no one would buy hats anymore if they took the bicycle. Look at the history of the umbrella. The first person who used an umbrella in London in the 18th century, he was attacked, he was harassed. It would take the jobs of the horse and coach people, because people were protected by their sort of the protection against the rain over there. But it also looked weird. He looked feminine when he used an umbrella. So basically everything, credit cards, vaccines, the internet, everything was awful according to the powers that be, the elites, and probably a majority of people as well. That's why I'm a liberal. I want to give minorities and crazies the chance to experiment with their ideas, even though we don't know if they will be the next great thing or if it will be horrible. And this is why liberals are strange, because everybody else has a fixed idea. They have a design, they have a plan, they know how society is supposed to be and how people should behave. The only difference between conservatives and progressives in the leftist sense is that they choose different ideals. Is it in the past or is it in the future? Is it that we should conserve something that we've noticed today, or is it that I have a great plan and I want to take everybody along the ride? But whatever they're looking for some sort of stasis, a place, a society, an economy that doesn't surprise us. And that would be awful. But this means that they are both sides. This is why I think sort of the Trump populist right and the more statist redistributionist left, they are both very uncomfortable in modern society, because now people have more education than ever before. They have more freedoms. We have the internet. We have international communication and exchange, which means that the ability to express your identity and decide on how you want to live your life is greater than, I would say, ever before. And that's terrible if you have a plan for people. It seems like the world is falling apart because people do all these strange, weird things. And that's why they, in different ways, they want to shut the borders or cancel everybody who doesn't agree with you. Some way of getting back to some sort of control. And I mean, to me, that's the world is a weird place, and it's dangerous in many ways. But this is comforting to me, that both the left and the right feel like the world is going to the dogs.
No, that's very interesting. I think what we can do is go to the last part, where we want to talk about liberalism for the 21st century, and basically what can our answer be to that closeness, to that basically status quo that conservatives and the more left-wing part of the political spectrum are hanging on to. Maybe we can also talk about what are the main challenges for us as liberal movement in today's day and age.
Well, right now, I would say that the greatest challenge that we face is that people are afraid of the world, and for different reasons, several reasons. I mean, we've gone through a rough period with a pandemic and with an economic crisis and the euro crisis and the migration crisis and the threat of terrorism and so on. But more than anything else, I think when it comes to Western Europe and North America, we have a new geopolitical situation as other countries, other parts of the world are growing economically and culturally and become more important. We lose relative clout. We lose relatively to others and other groups. And this is something that historically often results in lots of anxiety and a loss of cultural self-confidence in a way. And that is a very dangerous period, because when you lose cultural self-confidence, the instinct is to sort of fight or flight. You want to fight against someone, against the outside world, other countries, or against minorities back home, or just flee and hide behind tariff barriers and self-sufficiency and what have you, and big government strong men and so on. And that's a reason why I think that we're in for a period of populism, of strong men who say that they have a solution to everything that seems scary in the world today. And that's our major challenge, to talk about how mobilizing solutions to problems does not come from the top. It comes from mobilizing millions of people to use their local information and knowledge and imagination and work to come up with new solutions. And that will be a difficult battle, I'm sure.
Yes, I would say especially because you see when Europe is losing weight to other parts of the world, to other countries, but then we already mentioned China, but also some other, let's say, Asian countries like Singapore, they are not considered as liberals, they are more state planned. And would that be not a risk that some politicians in Western Europe would say, let's look at these examples and let's follow their way?
Yes, that's the risk, that we think that in order to beat China, we have to become China. And I think it's the other way around. Actually, if China wants to beat us, they have to become us. And the reason why I think so is that what has happened in China is that they've actually they had two hands tied behind their back with a planned economy, with the collectivized agriculture resulting in 50 years of hunger and destitution. What happened was that they released one hand, basically one arm, and made it possible for didn't come from the top. It came from the grassroots. It was local villages who started to secretly privatize their land in the 1970s to produce more. It was local villages who started businesses because they had ideas, but their children were unemployed. What happened was that Deng Xiaoping said, "Oh, we don't like that, but it seems like it's working better than our ideas. So let's give it our seal of approval." Now, when you do that, when you go from nothing to, when you go from two hands behind your back to just one hand behind your back, you can create incredible growth, at least in the short run. And it will look much more impressive than what we do with incremental change, because we've had 200 years of some sort of freedom like that. And the risk right now is that people in the West are going to say, look at China, they're doing very well with one hand tied behind their back. So let's tie one of our arms behind our back in order to combat them. I don't think that's the solution. And I think the reason why is that we are beginning to see that they are running into problems. it's easy to imitate ideas that you already know work. It is fairly, I wouldn't say it's easy, but you can do it. Get farmers from the rural areas into factories and create these impressive growth statistics. You can even create some sort of impressive entrepreneurial ability, partly by being very deregulated, actually, in the areas where the Politburo and the leaders really want to see results. But the problem is that they are not open to surprises. They are not open to crazy ideas. And the moment that they're impressive tech entrepreneurs come up with surprises and disturb the order, they are destroyed immediately. And that's what we've seen now recently, that they are basically, China, they're working hard to destroy their most impressive tech companies because they don't like surprises. And the problem for authoritarian places is that catch-up growth is fairly simple. You can look at what others do and do it better with a larger workforce and with less regulation in those areas. But when you've run out of that, you need domestic innovation. You need domestic crazies, like the first person who carried an umbrella in London. Those individuals need freedom to come up with the next growth sectors. And the Chinese model is not adapted to that. They might change and be open to that, but that's why they have to become more like us to defeat us.
And if we look at other challenges or other problems, let's say the pandemic and the reaction on that, again, I come back to Asia, but some people would say, look at Asian countries and how they manage this. This is clearly better than Western countries did it.
Yeah, they do say that.
It's China. It's more some other countries with.
Yeah, when it comes to China, we have to mention that the reason why we got this pandemic was that they imprisoned the whistleblowers who warned us about the potential virus. Even China's Supreme Court said that, look, had we listened to those rumors and the police had not interfered, we might not have had this outbreak. And I think I quote this in my book. They say something like, rumors and lies end where there is openness. That's what China's Supreme Court said. Well, yeah, try to learn that lesson till next time. I think one reason why many Asian countries, at least initially, did better was that they had more experience with it. They had the SARS pandemic. They've had more epidemics than we've had. So they had more of preparedness. I think it takes more research to see in which ways they really worked well and in which ways they didn't. And as we've seen, it's very easy early on in the pandemic to pick winners and losers and say who did best and worst. But I think it's more complicated than that. But there are things to learn from, definitely, and we should pay attention to that. But I mean, China, Japan, and South Korea, remember that they're open democratic market economies. So it's not the Chinese model that we're talking about there.
Yeah, we've seen in Europe, of course, maybe in your country the least of all of Europe, but of course the pandemic and the whole health aspect of it became in large part, of course, that was the right thing to do, but became a legitimation for very freedom interfering aspects. Do you see any risk there? Milton Friedman used to say there's no the most permanent government mention.
There's nothing as permanent as a temporary government program.
Indeed,
right?
Indeed. How do you see that evolving?
I would say that I'm worried about how we handled this pandemic generally, because we basically choose the Chinese model. I mean, in a more decent humanitarian way, but we really started to shut borders down, shut down societies, and shut down schools and businesses. And I'm not sure that's the best way to handle it. I think the Swedish experience where we had more of openness and is informative there, and we could discuss that, and that's something that will give work to researchers for a long time ahead, I'm sure. But also, there are always lots of threats to our health, to our lives. Perhaps a good way to deal with it is to inform people about that and how they should behave to avoid that, rather than immediately trying to sacrifice everything to deal with just one particular threat. Because the problem then is that you forget all the others. You forget the rest of society. The fact that there are terrible long-term implications of just shutting down schools for a couple of months for those children growing up long-term. And when it comes to definitely mental health and domestic abuse, when it comes to sheltering in place, we create problems for long-term for the economy, so that we have less resources for the hospital system research in new drugs in long-term. I know for a fact that just looking at low-income countries and middle-income countries around the world, just the fact that we abandoned the traditional vaccine campaigns against old child diseases is probably going to cost us more in terms of loss of healthy life years than the pandemic did. So it's always dangerous when we focus all our resources on just one problem. And that it worries me a little bit in the future if we did that now. And I mean, this pandemic has been horrible, so don't get me wrong, but historically speaking, it's nothing like the Spanish flu. It's nothing like some of the major disasters that we've been through. Well, what are we going to do next time around? If we're this quick to sort of implement fairly authoritarian measures, it makes me a little bit worried about what we're going to do the next time.
That's a clear message, and I think it's a clear message for all of us, for liberals, also in Belgium. Of course, we have already had other crises. I think 2008, the financial crisis, and again, liberalism was blamed. Was this correct, or was it more complicated?
Yeah, I wrote a book about the financial crisis called The Financial Fiasco, and so all my arguments are there. Well, free markets and liberalism will always be blamed for everything. Just sort of, it's a perfect whipping boy for all sides, definitely. But the strange thing when you look at it is how many of the factors that really created the crisis were the result of people saying, we don't want a crisis like the last one that we had. So this time around, well, we're going to lower interest rates dramatically, which resulted in people taking all their money out of bank accounts and moving into exotic real estate securities instead. We couldn't have a wild west of investment, so instead we should have a monopoly of credit ratings, who tells every investor, every pension fund what's safe to invest in and what not to. And when you do that, when you have that system of regulations, it means that everybody does the same thing. And what the monopoly of credit raters said was that there's one thing that's AAA and gives you a great reward, and that's all these securities tied to the American housing market. So everybody invested there. And then obviously government said that if you make money as a financial institutions, you'll get to keep all of it. If you lose it, we will bail you out. Well, that's kind of a one-side bet, isn't it? I mean, people talk about sort of casino capitalism, but I've never gone to a casino where the Minister of Finance sits next to me by the roulette and tells me, yeah, just go ahead and bet heavily. Because I'll pick up the bill and send it to the taxpayers if you lose. If they did, I would make crazy bets. Obviously, that would be in my best interest. So the story is not as simple as the sort of popular interpretation, I don't think.
I think we might see one of those examples in practice. Basically, the whole European MiFID regulation pushes conservative investors into the bond market. And if one day you will have a rise of the interest rates, which is happening in the United States already, it's exactly those conservative investments who will get the first hits. So it's it's basically a paradox of regulation in practice. Maybe talking about crises, we can also shift a bit. You're very much read within the eco-modernist movement in Belgium. So basically, who plead for a more tech-optimistic way of thinking, but also are pro new nuclear initiatives, etc. And in your book, you also talk about climate change as a knowledge problem. Maybe, if there is one crisis where we will also face a lot of chases or potential future crisis, it's the climate crisis. How do you look at that? What is the way to go as a liberal to position ourselves within this this sphere of climate crisis action?
Well, I'm happy to hear that the eco-modernists read me. I read them, and I think they've got important points to contribute with. And I think really that's the only way to deal with our environmental problems. Because, some people say that, look, it's all the fault of industrial civilization and our growth model. If we just abandoned that, we wouldn't emit these greenhouse gases. And well, you know what? We just experimented with that. We just tried to shut down the world for some 6 months last year. Nobody flew anywhere. Less mobility, less trade, and lots of production facilities just sort of shut down instantly. And what did that result in? Well, two things. First of all, a nightmare for vulnerable people around the world. Some 100 million people were thrown back into extreme poverty because of this shutdown of the world. But it didn't buy much of a reduction in greenhouse gases. Last year, we saw a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions of just 6%. 6%, even though we shut down the world. And that tells me that that's not the way to go about business, to reach the Paris Climate Accords by doing less trade, less flights. It would mean that we need one pandemic a year until 2030. And if you see the terrible human costs of this one, and I mean not of the pandemic, but just of the economic loss because of it, well, it tells you that's not the way to go about things. We need better ideas. We need better technologies to make sure that we can have the kind of growth, the kind of wealth that we have, but based on non-fossil fuels and energy sources. And the reason why I talk about it as a knowledge problem is that, I was very inspired by physicist David Deutsch, who said that, if something is permitted by the laws of physics, then the only thing that can prevent it from being technologically possible is not knowing how. So in other words, everything is a knowledge problem, and we have all these opportunities. We know that 1 hour of sunshine could power the world for a year if we just had the right ways of handling it. We know that we can get carbon dioxide out of the air and store it if we can make that technology come down in price. We have 4th generation nuclear. We've got biofuels made out of algae. We've got so many different ideas. And if everything is a knowledge problem, and not the least something where we have the problem here and we're just looking for solutions, well, the way to attain more knowledge is openness to new ideas and to experiments and to trial and error.
Thank you. I think just before going to the questions from the audience, maybe some questions about your home country, Sweden, because it's often mentioned in Belgium, but also in other countries, as a kind of socialist utopia, or a country that combines being economically competitive with a generous welfare state? And is this correct? And what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And this is because, for some reason, people's perception of everything lags behind some 50 years. Because then something dramatic happened, and you rarely hear about small countries like Sweden unless there's something dramatic. And the dramatic thing that happened in Sweden 50 years ago was that we experimented a little bit with the socialist ideas. We didn't go all the way, but we expanded the welfare state by 50%, regulated most things, high taxes, and yet we were one of the richest countries on the planet. And that told the world that this is something interesting going on in Sweden. We should do that. And that's what people still say 50 years from now. And what they've missed are two things. First of all, the reason why we could begin to experiment with that is that Sweden 60 years ago was more economically liberal than other European places. We had 100 years of very limited government, free markets, lower taxes than other European countries, lower taxes than even the United States. And that had made us into the fourth richest country on the planet. So we were incredibly wealthy, and then politicians said, oh, let's start redistributing, and we can just sort of do whatever because we're top of the world. That's the first thing that they miss, the background story. But the other story that they miss is what happened when we experimented with these ideas. Well, you know, that was the 25-year episode, the only one in the last 150 years, when Sweden began to lag behind all the other industrialized countries. The first period when we began to lose out, we didn't see an increase in real wages. We didn't create a single net job in the private sector. And the big companies that we're famous for, you know, Tetra Pak, IKEA, and so on, they moved away from Sweden because they couldn't do business here. It was a disaster. And don't take it from me. Take it from the guy who said that the Swedish experiment with democratic socialism was unsustainable, perverse, and absurd. And that was Kjell-Olof Feldt, the Swedish social democratic Minister of Finance in the 1980s. So what happened when it all ended in a terrible financial crisis in the early 90s was that, in a broad consensus from the left to the right, Sweden went back to the future, basically, began again to reduce the size of government, to lower taxes, deregulate markets, and in many ways became a more economically free country than other European welfare states. And we haven't gone as far as I would prefer, but compared to other places, we've done fairly impressive things, and things that haven't been done in other places, like reforming social security, pensions, introduce school voucher system so that private schools can compete as well, and a deregulation of product markets and of businesses that have gone far. And since then, Sweden has grown again much more rapidly than other countries around the world. So Sweden it's pretty decent, I would say, but it's not socialist.
That's a very clear conclusion about Sweden. One of the lessons you take away from Sweden is actually also a term that was coined by one of the unions, apparently. It's called the safety of wings. And how can safety of wings be a concept for liberals to fight for the coming decade?
Yeah, that is a wonderful concept, because, you know, we're talking about how do you create safety and security. The world is turbulent, and we have a constant restructuring, and not just because based on free trade and innovation. It could be just changed consumer habits. We don't read newspapers on paper anymore, which means that suddenly lots of paper industries are going out of business, and jobs are lost. So what do you do then? Well, there are two alternatives. You can just pay people not to work, take them out of the workforce. And that's something that is unfortunately often undone. And one reason why we've seen so much regions where people were on economic decline, rust belts in every country. Or you can do what the Swedish labor unions talked about. You can try to create the safety of wings, not the safety of sort of keeping people in place, or of subsidizing a particular job a little bit longer until it's really terribly on the decline, or the next economic crisis comes and everything falls apart at the same time. But instead, trying to constantly make sure to help people to move to the more dynamic sectors rather than to leave them behind in those areas. So safety of having wings means many different things. It could mean helping with retraining. It could mean that you try to create wage insurance for people rather than having very generous unemployment benefits. Instead, trying to give people an extra subsidy if they pick up a new job, even though the wage might be lower. Try to make sure that you have constantly up incentives to move to other places, both incentives and opportunities. Opportunities can be blocked in different ways. Minimum wages can be too high to sustain jobs in a less productive area. It could mean occupational licensing, so that you're not allowed to enter another job that you might be suited for, or perhaps in another country or in another state, as in the US. It could mean things like doing something about our hopeless housing market, where it seems impossible in most places to build anything close to anyone anymore, which means that it's hopeless to enter the most dynamic areas. So many different aspects of it, but the central message is try to give people wings rather than trying to give them just a payout to stay behind.
That's already a very good conclusion about social security and the state for the 21st century. Maybe a last question before we go to questions from the public. I think in the coming year here in Belgium, the Liberal Party, but also broader, of course, the whole liberal spectrum, will have to reinvent itself. Will have to, basically invent 21st century liberalism. Is there one clear message you want to give to the liberal movement in Belgium? What should be your focus, or what is the most important takeaway?
I think if I have to be so arrogant as to give advice on how to do things, what I would say are two things. First of all, it's incredibly important to find your own identity and have a self-confidence and sort of be able to rest in your own ideas. It's so easy for smaller ideological movements in a time with large ones that seem to be on the offensive to sort of begin to pick sides and adapt and so on. Try to do the thought experiment of them not being there and just sort of think about your own ideas, what's right and what's wrong, and the principles that you really believe in. That's where to start, not to start from politics as such and political parties as such. And that's so that's the first one. Some self-confidence, and the fact that people don't agree with you is not a sign that you're in a bad place. It might mean that you're more important than ever before. The other thing that I would say is that I think, and this is easier to say than to do, but it also relates to this thing, don't think about politics too much. Think about society. It's easy because we are so obsessed with politics, so that we think when we see these new strains and new movements and populists on the rise, that's what's important, and we have to sort of handle that and build that somehow into what we're doing. That is not the most important thing that happens in society. Societies, the economy, the culture, technological changes, and they are actually on our side, I would say, because there millions of people are hard at work of doing exactly the kind of things that fits with a liberal mission of innovating, of coming up with new ideas and new forms of cooperation and business models and ways of new identities. That's the important thing. That's what goes on in the real world. All the other things, that's just Twitter. So don't think about that too much. So, but more about society. And I think this could be that I'm just because I'm a historian, but I think there are things to learn from others who've been in our situation, or liberal political parties who have been in these situations before and worked hard to try to sort of channel the movements, the dynamic movements from society rather than politics. So I think there's much to gain from studying history.
Thank you very much. I think you gave some very important lessons for our politicians. I think I will not repeat everything you said, but I think the most important words were self-confidence, consciousness, and were the two most important words, I think, self-confidence and consciousness. But now it's time for questions from the audience. We will start with a question in Dutch, but we will, of course, translate it. It's a question about basic income. So you're also writing your book about the negative income tax, so it's somehow linked with that. But what's your opinion on basic income?
Well, I think it's worth taking more seriously than many free marketeers do. And one reason is that there's a real problem that has to be solved. And I'm not as worried about technological unemployment as people talk about. Because I think that what happens the moment we manage to automate anything, it just means that we have more purchasing power to solve other problems, and then we are always going to need people. And as long as it's difficult to get a person on the phone line the moment you have a problem with your computer or lost luggage or anything, then the problem is too few people and workers, not too many. But the problem that we have to solve is that it is very difficult for people to have incentives to work if they're stuck in unemployment and social exclusion. And one reason is how we've built the welfare system. One study recently showed that almost 40% of the unemployed in rich countries face a marginal rate higher than 80% if they take a job, because they lose the welfare and they have to start to pay taxes. 80%, if that was an 80% income tax rate, we would be yelling at the top of our voices. But now it affects the most vulnerable in our societies. Then we're going to have to do something about it. And a universal basic income would deal with some of that, because you wouldn't lose it the moment you take a job. So it doesn't destroy those incentives. I think there are problems with it. I have yet to see a version of the UBI that that handles the problem of it being incredibly expensive. It is very expensive if it is substantial and we give it to everybody. Then it's a very expensive way of subsidizing the middle class and the rich, basically. And if it's too low, well, then it's not much of a safety net for the most vulnerable, is it? So that's why I think that what we should look at more are negative income taxes, where you do add some of a basic income to people who fall below a certain threshold, and then you discount it the moment you move up the ladder, you lose some of it, but never all of it, and never most of it, I would say, because you want to keep those incentives there to constantly move to where the jobs are.
Maybe a next question. Julio asked a couple of questions, and I want to apologize in advance. I think in the interest of time, we'll have to pick one. But the question is, which global trends will shape the world economy in the next 10 years? Do you have any view on that, Mr. Norberg?
Well, if we're discussing sort of the mega trends, I would say that the most important ones are globalization, but I would say that I don't think it's disappearing. I think some countries will make the mistake of trying with self-sufficiency and protection in certain ways. I think those countries will lose out, and I think we'll see that and we'll keep on doing it, which means that more people around the world will contribute to our global pool of knowledge and innovation, and that will be an important factor. The second one is urbanization. I mean, in 2007, for the first time in world history, half of the world population live in cities, and that's amazing. And it's great news, because cities, that's the place where you're close to others, and you can have more of a specialization, division of labor. You come across more combinations of ideas, and generally living standards and productivity are higher, and that will have a tremendous effect as that happens around the world. Because in poorer countries, it's not just about sort of perhaps your annual income is a bit higher and you don't notice because housing is more expensive. But in poor countries, it means that you suddenly have access to health clinics, you suddenly have access to safe water and an education for girls as well. So that's the second one. And the third factor would be digitalization in different ways, the way in which we turn everything into ones and zeros. No, I would have to add to that. Generally, technological changes, including digitalization. But that's important in itself, because it creates more of a global hive mind, where it'll be easier and quicker to accumulate knowledge and solve problems. But also in other areas, with the way artificial intelligence then can make use of that, the way with biotechnology, we can come up with basically the same thing, but for biology, which we've already seen when it comes to developing vaccines in a record period of time. That has tremendous ability of changing and of improving our world. So those are the important trends. And if I have to add another one, I think we'll have some major spoilers as well. There will be great powers who aren't, because they're too authoritarian, they won't make it into the next step of becoming really innovative, open economies themselves. But they will be powerful and rich, and they might try to spoil it for us. Could be militarily, could be just generally undermining our societies, and that will shape the world economy as well.
Next question is from Tom de Latte. Also, he asked a couple of questions, so in the interest of time, we had to pick one. He asks about a way to counter today's populism. He suggests Max Roser's good news message, but maybe broader as well. How can we combat this populist trend?
Yeah, well, the problem is that we're also focused on everything that goes wrong. For obvious evolutionary reasons, Mother Nature is an economist and knows that we can't pay attention to everything that happens. So if something goes right, don't bother, because that's not a threat to your survival. But any kind of bad news is something that you have to pay immediate attention to. And then with a global news cycle, anything that goes wrong anywhere will top the news cycle everywhere, and it'll give us the impression every morning that the world is falling apart. Yes, we have to deal with that. We have to handle that somehow, because it makes us depressed. But also, when we become afraid, we want somebody to protect us. It's this fight or flight again. What can we do about that? Well, I think statistics and context is incredibly important, and that's why I constantly talk and write about that. That's why Max Grosser and his Our World in Data project is so important, making that accessible to everybody. And even though we're not looking at it constantly, and you can't ask of people to do that, at least knowing that it's there, that there is a broader story connected to any kind of dark headline that you read, that's important in itself. I think that journalists have some sort of responsibility there as well. When they talk about the disaster of the day, perhaps they should have some sort of context link to broader knowledge about this. Nobody will click it, but they will know that there's more to the story than this terrible headline that makes you look at it. I think that would be important.
Next question is from Laurent de Meester, also a former board member of LVSV. It's a little bit longer question, but in general, if we summarize, we can say he's rather pessimistic about EU regulation on, for example, he says it causes brain drain, and how do we deal with that?
Yes, this is bad. The point of the EU is that it's open, and that's amazing. It's an incredible achievement. And apart from trying to create more of an international cooperation for harmony and peace, it also means that we have sort of a continent of experiments, of different solutions, of innovations in various places to see what works best. Unfortunately, combined with this tendency then of standardizing and regulating everything on the continent, we kind of short circuit some of that openness. And how do we combat that? Well, it's difficult because the forces are so strong. I think it comes down to trying to wage opinion, influencing people, talking about the value of innovation. I think when we see how, when we have a little bit more of a sense of urgency, for example, during this pandemic, the incredible achievements that can be done in, for example, medical research, in mRNA technology and things like that, I think that opens minds a little bit to what can be done, because we're also a little bit fed up with this sort of the stagnation of innovation and solution in various places. I think those are useful examples to combat this trend. And another way is obviously to try to come up with more and better free trade agreements with other places. For example, with the US, and I think would be important because that, and then sort of, because then it's difficult to tailor our regulations to particular companies that we are in favor of. The more countries that are involved in setting standards, the more difficult it should be to tailor make it to certain incumbents.
We will go to one of the last questions, maybe one more after this, but Thomas van Wing has a very interesting question of something we didn't touch upon yet, but I think he's right that it's, yeah, we're really at a crossroads moment in the sense of privacy, not only by big corporations and the government, but also just the principle. Culturally, there seems to be less importance in it. So his question is, how do we deal with it? Do we have to be pragmatic about it? But maybe my question additionally is, should it be more of a focus in the future, or what's your take on it?
I think it has to be more important in the future, the more important our information is. That's, I mean, we don't have property rights to air because it's everywhere. But if it's a limited valuable resource like land, we suddenly create rights and begin to distinguish what's mine and what's yours and what you can do with it. And now I think the same thing is happening with our personal information and data. And we're going to have to look probably at some regulatory changes and at least keep that discussion open. What worries me most is the fact that there is a strange distinction in the debate where it seems like governments can do almost anything with our data, but we're very much afraid of Facebook. And that doesn't make sense, because what Facebook can do is sell advertisements with it. What the government can do is that they can do anything with it. We need a little bit more of suspicion towards government use of our data. When it comes to how we use it on social media and other things, I think we have been, all users of social media have been fairly naive about it, and we haven't thought this through. I think we should. And I think as we do that, I think there will be a market for other kinds of solutions. I can see in the future certainly how we might want to disperse our data only to trusted third parties. Perhaps just like we put our savings in the bank, or we used to at least, perhaps we should put our data in a particular data bank that's trusted by us, and that promises and guarantees that they can't leave it to anybody else without our admission. And in that case, they would stand between me and a place like Facebook, and sort of the moment I log on and decide to start an account there's these microseconds of negotiations between my data bank and them, where they decide where my data bank decides whether this is a trusted place as well, or whether there are other conditions there. I think those kinds of solutions and different experiments with it, because this is a difficult field and we don't know exactly where the lines are going to be drawn. We need experiments like that to learn more.
I think we have time for one last question. Question from Jos Spijbroek. It's about the difference between cooperation and competition. And is there a difference, or are they two sides of the same coin?
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Can you repeat the question? For some reason, it blurred out there.
No problem. The question is about the difference between cooperation and competition. Is there a difference, or are they two sides of the same coin?
That's a very good question, and I handle this in the book quite a bit. I think that the reason why I focus so much on cooperation is that everybody talk about competition and think that that's what open societies and free markets are all about. My point is that I don't think that's the case. Not when I introspect and think about, well, when I go to the local store and buy ingredients for dinner, if they happen to not have a product that I want, it's not that I sort of run away and go to the competition straight away. I ask them, could you please buy this product in the future because I want it? And the same goes if I have an employee and they don't do exactly what I thought they were supposed to do. It's not that I immediately fire them and hire the competition. We talk about it, we discuss it, and perhaps that person needs retraining, what have you, I don't know. But it means that cooperation is the primary aspect of it. Finding people with whom I want to cooperate for mutual gain, so that we do our best and exchange it for their best instead. That's the primary aspect of free markets. But then competition is the way out. It's the emergency exit if it doesn't work. If I go to the store and say, you should buy these goods because I want to buy them, they tell me, oh, get out of here. We don't want your kind of people here. We don't care about your demand for these goods. Well, then I go to the competition. It's an emergency exit if cooperation doesn't work. And it's an incredibly important one, because it's the one that makes sure that we don't end up in very exploitative relationships that doesn't suit us. And that's why it is necessary, but it's necessary to make sure that cooperation works in the best way. So that's why I focus so much on cooperation, because we need a rebalancing of how people think about what's important in capitalism. It's actually not the cooperation. It's not actually not the competition. It is the cooperation.
I think that's a very nice way to end this talk. Mr. Norberg, thank you so much for your time. For the people in the audience, the book is available in a lot of the bookshops, de Standaard, de FNAC, Hoe een open wereld ons verder brengt, uitgegeven door Nieuw Amsterdam, toch een zeer gerenommeerde uitgeverij. I also want to thank Pieter for today, for his moderating it together, and maybe also broader. It was let's say a very special period the last half year. We started as a new team within the LVV, and we were faced, as a lot of organizations and companies, with the pandemic. And we really hope that this is the last online activity, that the next one we can shake hands or not, but at least greet each other in real life. And yeah, I'm thanking you all for the attention, also for the viewers that look at it afterwards, which is mostly let's say a much bigger number than the live viewers. So thank you also for your attention. And yeah, hopefully we see each other this summer or after this summer in real life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.